Moderator. I've been the moderator for almost all the conferences that we've had over the last 19 years. And this is our 19th. Next year we'll have to have a big 20th anniversary celebration. This is wonderful. Connie's been doing a great job, and all the ISSB people planning these conferences. We're excited about the program today. So I just need to get a few logistics out of the way. We want to make sure that everybody knows the restrooms are out in the hallway there. You turn to the right, and then they're on the right, and you can see a lot of exits here. And we're wondering how many people have been to a previous conference that we've had? Quite a few. Okay, was anybody here at the first conference? Oh my, okay. Yeah, of course, Connie. Yes, and Andrea, yes. And we have some Baskin-Robbins coupons to give out. They're only good at the Baskin-Robbins in Davis, but if anybody would like one, I can give them to somebody to pass out if you would like to do that. And who was raising their hands at having been at the first conference? Who would like a Baskin-Robbins certificate? And also, we're trying to figure out how far people have come. Sometimes we get people from East Coast. So who came within, over 100 miles? Oh my, we have, oh goodness, over 100 miles. Where are you from? San Diego. Wow. Did she beat everybody else? No? Where are you from?
We moved up to Washington State.
Oh, I see.
I still come there.
Right, well still, that's quite a ways. And over there?
Iowa.
Iowa. Okay, I'm sorry, I think she beat you. So make sure they get a Baskin-Robbins over there coming from Iowa City with her daughter. So thank you very much. And our keynote speaker today is Linda Barnard, and she's going to speak for about an hour and 15 minutes. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll have Geraldine Stolley and a representative from Jim Beal's office, Senator Jim Beal, who authored SB 131, a bill to remove the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. How about that? As if the trauma had a statute of limitations. And then we'll do lunch and networking. And we have sandwiches from Subway this time, veggie, I believe chicken teriyaki, and maybe turkey or tuna or something. And if you could at least please give $5 to cover the cost, because ISSB spends the money for that. I did the shopping this year, so I found out how much it all costs. But generally, we don't get a whole lot of money for that. So if we could at least cover the cost for the lunch, that would be great. And after lunch, we will have Kathleen Russell, No Way Out But One documentary, and then Helen Lynn and Jane Stevens with the ACE study. So now I will introduce Linda Barnard from the program. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice in Sacramento since 1981, and after only a year doing that, she has served as trainer and consultant for domestic violence programs in Northern California since 1982, so that about 30 years or more for both of those. So thank you very much. So Dr. Linda Barnard.
I apologize that I can't stand. I wish I could. Is this thing working? I was looking at Jerry out there and I was thinking that people often refer to all of us as the old war horses because we've been doing this for so long, and now that I ride my scooter, I really do feel like an old war horse, riding around on my aluminum horse, or my metal horse. See lots of familiar faces out there. Interestingly, Susan and I ran into each other out in the hallway. I worked on Susan's case, how many years ago was that? 99. 99? Oh my gosh. I can remember once being at the IVAC conference, and there was a panel up there of protective parent, or actually of courageous kids. And I had obviously never met most of these kids. I think I had met Karen's son, but all these kids are up there and they're telling their stories. And they said their first names and they're telling their stories, and one by one I'm thinking, I worked on that case. Wait a minute, I know that kid's mom. I worked on that case. I think of the 7 kids that were up there, I've worked on 5 of those cases as an expert witness in those cases. So, you know, some of us have been around a long time doing this, trying to make a little bit of headway, and frequently it feels like we're shoveling sand against the tide, but you know what? We just keep shoveling. Ultimately, you'll get a hill if you keep shoveling long enough. And I was wondering if Connie was responsible for that quote on the wall. Is that always up there, or did you put that up there? I thought that was kind of an interesting quote. Take a look at that. So we're here today to talk about the family courts, and I'm trying to move things here, about the family courts and the crisis in the family courts when it comes to child custody and sexual abuse cases. Now, many of us that are in this room have worked in this field for a long time. Some of you are protective parents. Some of you are people who are here to learn about this process. I don't know who's who, so I'm going to try to speak generally to the middle of that. We're going to have some question time at the end. Usually I don't care if people ask questions while I talk. Is that okay with everybody? It's fine with me if you want to ask questions while I'm talking, because I'd rather talk about things that you want to know about than just me decide what it is you ought to know. So we can kind of try to move through, but also I'll take your questions. One of the things about the family courts is, well, let me back up a minute. Any of you who are from around here, it's been all over the news that this family that are German immigrants have a 5-month-old baby who has had a heart murmur problem since the day the baby was born. They were at Sutter General Hospital, who wanted to do surgery on the baby. They wanted a second opinion, so against medical advice, they took the baby out of the hospital and went directly to Kaiser Hospital to get a second opinion. And when they got to Kaiser Hospital, the police met them there, and their child was taken away from them, supposedly because of neglect, because they took their child out of Sutter Hospital against medical advice. So here we have CPS jumping right in on a case that probably is wrong, that they've probably done the wrong thing. And of course they can't have a hearing until Monday because it's a weekend. So these people are without their child all weekend and get 1 hour visitation a day, I believe, supervised visitation. So I was looking at that case, and then I'm looking at all the cases that we've had. I'm from Sacramento, so all the cases that we've had around Sacramento County where a child or several children come forward and say their principal molested them, or a teacher molested them, or a coach, and it's all over the headlines, and the person's prosecuted, they're arrested, they're prosecuted. Usually they're found guilty, and the children get a lot of support, the family gets a lot of support. They get therapy, they get assistance through the Victim Witness Assistance Program because they're a victim of a crime, and the process and the system goes forward. Then we have somebody who's in family court. That was a good segue to that. That was good. We have someone that's in family court and things blow up. That was very good. See, you timed that perfectly. We have somebody that goes to family court, and in the process of family court, while the parents are getting a dissolution of their relationship, or if they weren't married, they're doing a child custody process. In the middle of that process, a child comes forward and says, I was sexually abused by one of my parents, and maybe 2 or 3 of the children, if there are several children, all say I was sexually abused by that parent, and nobody gets on the news, nobody gets charges against them, nobody gets arrested, nothing happens except the case gets sent to mediators and evaluators, because the family courts automatically assume that if an allegation of sexual abuse is brought up during a family court process, that somebody has to be lying. So what we have are the same children making the same allegations with the same stories, with the same explanations, and we have 2 different systems that behave in 2 different ways. The child that makes that disclosure in the family court system gets none of those benefits that a child gets who made the disclosure in another context. So there's no victim witness assistance, there's no court procedure, there's nothing that goes on that validates that child, validates that protective parent. What happens instead is they're vilified. Now, what in the heck happened to make the family court system so much different than any other legal procedure in our country. And that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about a lot today, not just me, but all of the speakers. Something happened that our family court system got broken. Now, if a child makes an allegation of sexual abuse in some other context, a detective gets assigned to the case. Now, a detective is someone who is trained to go out and collect evidence, is trained to interview people, is trained to look for evidence, is trained to look behind what people are saying, is trained to look for what really is going on here, and then make a recommendation to their supervisor or to the courts or the district attorney. That's what these people are trained to do. They're not infallible, but it's what they're trained to do. So if you make a disclosure of sexual abuse in the family court system, who are you sent to? A therapist. Somebody like me. Am I trained in how to interrogate someone? Well, I wasn't when I was in the military, so I'm unusual. But by and large, therapists are not trained to do that. Am I trained in how to collect evidence in a legal procedure? No. No therapist is, unless they have a background in law enforcement. Am I trained to determine whether someone is telling the truth or not? No, I'm not. Can anybody really do that? No. Nobody can do that. Lie detector test can't do it. Nobody is actually can tell whether someone's lying or not. Nobody has that ability. Now, someone who's a detective and is more trained in how to do interrogations is probably going to be right more of the time than a therapist is. Because what is a therapist trained to do? How many of you in this room are therapists, have therapist background? Okay, quite a few people. Okay. Therapists are trained to work with people, to show empathy, to help someone who has work with a goal and help the person achieve that goal, to find consensus among people, to help with problem solving. Okay, we're not trained to be interrogators. We're not trained to be investigators. That is not a part of our training. But if you're in the family court system and if there's a disclosure of sexual abuse, who you're sent to is not a detective, but a therapist. And that's if you have money. Don't get me started on the thing about what happens between people who have money and don't have money, because we don't have time for me to talk about all of that. Okay, so the first thing you might be sent to is a mediator in the family court system. Okay, those folks do a pretty good job of what they do, but they're not trained to assess whether a child is telling the truth about having been a victim of child sexual abuse. Most of the time when there is a disclosure in the family courts, the case is old, or sometimes it's not. Okay, does a therapist necessarily know about referring a child to UC Davis to get an evidentiary exam? Now, law enforcement would do that right away. That would be the first thing they would do, is take the child for an evidentiary exam. And those aren't infallible either, because many times the abuse has happened over a period of time. And we all know that a child can be sexually abused, a girl can be sexually abused, and that doesn't necessarily mean that her hymen is broken. A boy can be sexually abused, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be physical evidence that he's been penetrated. But the people who do that know how to look for the signs of whether abuse has occurred. That's what they do. They have a team at UC Davis, and that's in Sacramento, and every community has their own program that does that. I have no idea what they do in Iowa City, Iowa, or why someone from Iowa is here. We're going to have to talk, because that's intriguing. But every community has its own response team. Okay, now, if you're sent to a psychologist for an evaluation, does that psychologist have any background or training in how to do an evidentiary exam? Absolutely not. And if you tried to do one, you'd be breaking the law. Do most of those folks refer then for an evidentiary exam? No, that's not what they're there to do. So if you're in one system, you get an evidentiary exam. that may or may not help the case. But if you're in the family court system, you don't get that. What you get is someone who is trained as a therapist, and they may be really, really good as a therapist. There was a study I heard somebody quote one day who had said that 80% of therapists think that they're in the top 5% of being good. And I found that kind of interesting. Everybody thinks they're really good. And I suppose if you went to auto mechanics, maybe they would all think that they're really good too, but we have more objective measures of whether they are or not. But so anyway, let's just assume that you're one of those really good therapists, that you're sent to one of those really good therapists, and they're competent, they know what they're doing. But you're not trained as a therapist or a mental health person to make that kind of assessment. So what do we call those? A 311 evaluation, 3111? Is that what it is when they send a child to be assessed?
3111.
What is it?
3111.
That's what I thought. 3111.
It's the family code.
So family court sends you for a 3111 evaluation if there's an allegation of sexual abuse. Now, what does that mean? It means that you're sent to a therapist who is going to decide and assess whether or not there was sexual abuse. Now, I would defy anyone to tell me what psychologist in any community has any training to make that evaluation. Okay, now, again, let's assume you're one of those 80% of people who think you're really good, and maybe you are really good. But you don't have any training to make that assessment. You don't have a clue. You are shooting in the dark if you believe that a therapist knows how to make an assessment of whether there was child abuse. There is solid research to show that therapists are no better at determining whether someone's telling the truth than anybody else is. It's just not possible. It's not your training, it's not your background, it's not what you know how to do, and there's nothing about an interview process that's going to help you make that determination. The other thing I love is they send you out for a home visit to observe the parents with the children in their home. Now, who in their right mind would not be on their best behavior when somebody's coming out to evaluate them? And it's almost always known that they're coming out because they want to see how the child acts with the parent and all those sort of things. So they go out and do a home visit, or they observe the child and the parent in the office, which is even less effective. And then what happens is a decision is sent, a report is written, it's usually quite wordy, and they're usually many, many pages long with a lot of nice psychobabble in them that tells the court whether this child was telling the truth about being sexually abused, and more importantly, whether one of the parents put them up to it. Because if you go through the criminal court process that's outside family court, their first instinct is not to say that whoever is the primary parent of the child is lying, putting the child up to it for some sort of gain. That is not where they start. But in family court, that's where it starts. And that's part of the problem that we have. There was a very comprehensive study that was done by Daniel Saunders that anybody can get for free because it was published. You can get it online. It was about looking at the family court process, what happens with the family courts, what's going on there, because we all wonder what the heck happened. Because there may be some evil people in the family court system, but I choose to believe that most of the people in the family court system are probably well-meaning or start out that way. So what happens to the process? Because there is turnover sometimes in the judges, there's turnover in the judges. There's turnover in the evaluators, although it seems to me in Sacramento County the same people have been doing it for the whole time I've been around here. There are different mediators, there are different folks that do these things. What happens, though, that the system keeps being in the same broken way? Why isn't it that when new people come in, there's a fresh look at it, somebody actually reads a piece of friggin' research, okay, that's out there that shows that children don't make up being sexually abused? That just doesn't happen. People believe that women make up being raped because that's who's on the news. But no more women make up being raped than people make up being assaulted in any other kind of way. No more children lie about being sexually abused, and actually fewer than any of those other cases. So the research shows us that if we're going to err in a direction, we should err in the direction of believing a child who says they're sexually abused. Because that's what the research shows. Now, do the people in family court read the research? I don't know, because it sure seems to me they must not, because the things that they're doing defy what's in the research. And I will say to someone, because most of the people who work in the Sacramento family court system don't like me very much, and even though it turns over, I think the word gets passed from one to the next that Linda Bernard's a troublemaker. And I'm a troublemaker because I ask people to be accountable for their choices and their behavior. I ask people in my life, and I ask myself to be accountable for the things that I do. So why should I not ask people who hold the futures and the lives of children in their hands to be accountable for what they do? But when I ask them to do that, it pisses them off. Okay, so my reputation as a troublemaker, and frankly, I'm rather proud of that. I had a woman who was in the midst of a custody assessment case up in a different county, up in El Dorado County, and she was told she had to go to therapy, court ordered to therapy. So she asked around to a bunch of people, and they said, well, you ought to see Linda. And so she came to see me, and she had a custody evaluation done by a person up there, and when she told the person that she was seeing me, the person's first response was, oh, I don't know if you ought to be seeing her, she's a problem. Well, I'm a problem because I don't like some of the things that people do, and I'm going to ask them, how did you come to this? What research have you read to support this? Jerry's out here in the audience. Jerry's a researcher, okay? And a darn good one, has been doing this work in the field for more years than I have. She will say to people, what's the data show? What's there? Look at it. Okay, if you're going to have the lives of people in your hand and making big decisions about their future, shouldn't you have read some of the research that says children don't lie about sexual abuse? The whole issue of parental alienation is bogus. There's nothing to support it. And if I don't get off on some other tangent, I'll talk to you about some of the facts from the research about that. But people come into the family court system, and we just had a turnover of judges, in the last 6 months in Sacramento County. And I don't know whether the prior judges put a bug in their ear or something that says, oh, by the way, anybody who comes in here and says that their child's been sexually abused, don't believe them. Even though you believed them 6 months ago when you were in criminal court and working that rotation, don't believe them down here in family court, because down in family court it's about telling lies to get an advantage in custody. Okay, I don't know what happens when there's a new circle of people who become evaluators. I know in Sacramento County they used to have, like once a month or once every couple months, they got together and kind of talked to each other. And there's a person that I know who's a pretty good evaluator, and he's from another county, and he wanted to work here in Sacramento County. And I've known him for years, and he came to one of my trainings many years ago down in San Diego at the IVAC conference. And so when he wanted to get approved to be in Sacramento, he went to that monthly meeting. And I have no idea why my name came up in this monthly meeting, but he came back to me and said, man, they were spending some time really trashing you. And I hadn't even done anything lately to earn that respect. And so he came back to me, and he said, I was afraid to say that I knew you because I was trying to get on the panel, and I thought if I said that I knew you, they would vote me down. But he got on the panel, so that's a good thing. But something happens where the minute people get into the family court system, we forget everything that we knew in every other system about child sexual abuse. We forget everything we knew about domestic violence, which I do more work in domestic violence, but we forget everything we know about family violence suddenly when we get involved in the family court system. Some of you probably know Seth Goldstein. He's an attorney that does a lot of work with child sexual abuse and family court cases where there are issues about child sexual abuse. And I just lost my train of thought. Don't you love it when that happens? What was I going to say about Seth? I don't even remember, just had a little brain fart there. Chalk that one up. I'll probably remember it in a few minutes and I'll jump back to it. But when we get into the family court system, I know what I was going to say. Seth often does depositions with people who do 3111 evaluations or who do the custody evaluations, and he will ask them, what's the last research study that you read about family violence? I don't know. Can you name the last 5 that you read? They can't name 5. What's the last study that you read about child sexual abuse? Tell me the last 5 you've read. They can't give him the last 5. What's the last studies that you've read? Because of course they've got alienation in their reports. What are the last studies that you read about alienation? Well, sometimes they've been to a conference or something to support that. So sometimes they can name 1 or 2 things they've read about alienation. But we've got people who are doing this work who can't name the last 5 studies pieces of research that they've read, or the last 2 books that they've read. I don't know about you, but I find that offensive. I spend a lot of my time reading research, getting on the internet. I get alerts about certain subjects of new things that come out. I subscribe to journals, and I'm old school. I still get a lot of them hard copy instead of just reading them online. But I don't know if any of you are watching the Jodi Arias trial, the circus down in Phoenix. I can't get anything done. That thing needs to get over because I can't get any work done. But the one expert that was called in rebuttal, Dr. DeMarte, they asked her to name 5 people, or just to name some people who had written articles about domestic violence that she'd read, because she was purporting that she was a domestic violence expert. The only one she could name was Lenore Walker. And we knew she could name her because she obviously went online and read the things that Lenore wrote back in 1979, and then has updated a few times since about how to assess for domestic violence. And so she knew the 6 things that she could recite, but she didn't understand anything about it. But she couldn't name any other people in the field of domestic violence. Now, I'm sorry, but if you're a specialist in a field and you can't name 5 other people that are in your field, I'm thinking that's a problem. Maybe it's just me, but I'm thinking that's a problem. So if you're doing assessments for child sexual abuse and you can't name 5 people that are in the field who have done studies in the field, or name 5 articles that you've read, I have a problem with that. Because things change all the time. Anybody in here who is a clinician or a therapist, we go to school, we do the stuff, you get out of school, the last thing you want to do most of the time is read more stuff. Because you've just spent however much of your time reading stuff. The problem is the stuff we need to read changes all the time. Why do you think there are all these journals out there? I mean, some of them I think exist just to self-perpetuate themselves, and I could name a couple of them, and they're done by people I don't have any respect for, that they have a journal so they can write all their own stuff with all their own people. But most of the time, the journals that are out there, that are good, solid, refereed journals, have important things to say about the field. And if we don't keep up with it, then our knowledge of what we've done stops the day we got out of graduate school. And I can tell you that there is nothing you learn in graduate school that helps you know whether or not a child is telling the truth about whether they were sexually abused. I don't care whether you have a PhD, I don't care whether you have a master's degree. Nothing in your field of study gave you the ability to decide or determine or to have the ability to assess whether or not a child was sexually abused. Likewise, nothing in your field of training and no test you can give will tell you whether someone's a perpetrator of child sexual abuse. You can give them all of the MMPIs, all the MCMIs, all of the Rorschachs, all of the whatevers you want to give them, and nothing about those tests will determine the difference between someone who's a perpetrator of child sexual abuse and someone who isn't. The test can't do that. So when people do evaluations in family court, they give a bunch of tests, they charge a whole bunch of money. They do all these things, some of you have been through this. They send you to their hand-picked therapist They force the child to go to a hand-picked therapist. And usually, unfortunately, that hand-picked therapist is one who is trying to convince the child that they're lying. Because if you go into the process with the bias of a child is lying, then what you're going to do is try to move forward everything that's going to support your bias. Now, Jerry can tell you a lot more about this research kind of thinking than I can, okay? But if you go in with bias, then you're going to get information that supports your bias. So the family courts go in with the belief that children lie most of the time about sexual abuse in the family courts. So then we send that child to someone to be evaluated who has no knowledge or ability or skill or background to really do that assessment. Then we send them to a therapist who's going to tell them, now this parent has been trying to alienate you from your other parent, so we need to work with you to make you see that parent that you obviously lied about. So now we put this child who's been sexually abused in therapy, telling them they have to reunify with the parent who they say sexually abused them. Now again, if we were in the criminal court system, they would give restraining orders, they would do everything in the world to keep the parent who hurt the child away from them. In family court, we do everything in the world to make them be together and to pretend that it didn't happen. Now, part of why we have, I'm supposed to leave time for questions. How long am I talking? Oh man, I got a lot of time now. Am I talking till 11 o'clock?
Yeah.
Wow. That's cool. I thought I only had 45 minutes. Oh, we're going to have fun yet. Okay. All right. So something has happened to break the family court system. And as I said earlier, I don't want to believe that everybody's in that system is evil. I know people in the system, and I liked them and thought they were pretty good therapists, but I don't think they're necessarily people who are really good at assessing for child sexual abuse. Because they're not. Okay, so what happens that people get into that system who I believe were probably well-meaning people, competent professionals in their field, let's assume that, okay, and they suddenly start working in the family court system. What happens to them? Why does that system hold this belief that children and parents that say that there was sexual abuse are lying? What happens? Okay, part of what we know happens is that there's already a bias in that system, that if people go into family court, everybody's going to lie to get an advantage. Okay, people go into that believing that. Okay, and I think that's been believed since I was a child and my parents were getting divorced. People just sort of believe that whatever people say in family court must be a lie because they're in this contentious sort of situation. Okay, so whoever says this or whoever says that must be lying. Well, I also have a problem with all of that about family court because unlike criminal court, where I spend most of my time working, they don't care about evidence in family court, apparently. And that's always been perplexing to me because you can prepare a case and you can put the evidence. Now we've got emails and we've got text messages and we've got all of these things where we can show what somebody has done or said or how they presented it. And it's evidence. I mean, you can get those things subpoenaed and it's evidence. It's not just coming off of you. It's coming from a cell phone operator. Okay, it's coming from there. So we can gather that kind of evidence. We have evidence about behaviors that people have done, of whether somebody has taken the child for their dental appointments or whether they showed up at any of their sporting events or whether they've ever been to the school, whether they've ever met